Let me first start by thanking Keith Herron and Heather Winkler for helping organize this. It was all sort of organized remotely, and they were wonderfully helpful in that process. To Joe Kearns, Alex Smith, and the choir for the beautiful music that they shared with us today. As I said, we wanted to give people the chance to share their own remembrances. I'm, as I said, a psychologist and a neuroscience professor, and one of the things that I study in my work is memory and the mechanisms of memory and how memories are formed and updated and decay. And so what I know is that memory is fallible, and memory I wanted to share memories, but I also appreciate that memories are fallible, memories are malleable, memories get rewritten and updated. And so I didn't want to rely on my own memory, so I decided I would consult some of my dad's memories. My dad was a really creative person, and beginning in 1965, he would. Sorry, I'm like my brother, it's apparently genetic. Every year, he would compose a book set to verse with illustrations for my mother. The first one was in 1965, and it recounted the prior year. And this one in 1965 was the one at the end of which he proposed to her. And they're illustrated. It says, "Will you marry me? Asterisk, date June 1966, unless this isn't possible." And then down here it says, "We could have a wonderful future together." And it includes his self-depiction of himself as sort of a frumpy fellow. And of course she said yes, and every year from there until my mom's passing, he produced this book that remembered the prior year. The first of these volumes served as a record for 1965 and ended with the marriage proposal. And every year since then, he produced a new volume documenting the prior year. There were three areas that were consistently reviewed every year. Their work, the church, Grace Episcopal Church, where they're very actively involved, and of course, family. But also hinted out throughout all these volumes were memories of my dad's hobbies and his interests. For example, my dad was a craftsman. He loved to build things out of wood. It began with his attempts to build a bookshelf in my parents' first apartment. The verse reads, "The plan was my own, designed it myself. Quite simple it was to build a bookshelf. I took hammer and drill, the tools of the trade, and worked on the plans I'd hastily made. But planning was easy, the building was rough. I'd do either too little or not quite enough." And shows himself with his resulting shamble of a bookcase. But he stuck with it, and his skills improved until ultimately, several years later, he presented his study in our house at 833 South Main. And he wrote, "Indeed, as the end of spring break drew quite near, I completed a project that had taken a year. At last, with joy undiminished, my study was ready. In fact, it was finished." And this was a study that he built that had floor-to-ceiling, wall-to-wall bookshelves with all his books, and a big desk where you would find him. And this, of course, is where we would find him every night when we came home, however late it was. We would always have to peek around the corner and say, "Hey, Dad, I'm home." And we would always find him in his study with his headphones on and his green visor, grading or reading, or probably in December working on these volumes that he made for our mother. I think Rachel took this picture for a high school photography course that she was taking. My dad was an avid cyclist. This began when we were very little. It got off to a bit of a bumpy start in 1973 when, while carrying Rachel and me, he had an accident that knocked out some teeth and left a scar on his chin. The verse he wrote for this was, "And of course in recounting we both must remember a bike ride I took toward the 1st of November. With Rachel and Noah I pedaled apace till my wheel caved in and the road met my face." And this was a turning point, a pivotal point in his life when he transitioned from this gentleman that some of you may have known into this gentleman who I certainly know through my whole life, always with a beard. As Nathaniel alluded to, he was a self-trained chef. His culinary training, I think, began in 1981, at least according to these books, when he took over the kitchen to support my mom, who was on one of her periodic diets. It was apparently a quite limited and not very tasty repertoire. As he wrote, I'm going to read this one anyway. This was a later bike accident that he had so we'll go back to biking, in 1989. And this was at the corner of 15th and Main in Ottawa, where there's one of the few stoplights in town. And he was riding, stopped at the stoplight, and a car was on the other side turning left, and the setting sun from the west was apparently in that person's eyes, and they turned right into him, and he smashed their windshield. To document this event, he wrote, "At 15th and Main, crossing the street, my bike and a car just happened to meet. If I had right of way, no legal morass. I felt reassured as my head broke the glass. A hospital bed, observation routine. They check out the x-rays to see what they mean. By the time that I heard that I had 5 ribs broken, my pain had informed me they needn't have spoken. To the bathroom and toilet I demanded access. Deny me that plea and I'd make a mess. For you see, I am modest about some things I can't speak, but in that tin bottle I could not take a leak. I had my way, stepped out on the floor, set off for the toilet, but collapsed with a roar. I learned on that journey about muscular spasm. I soon could pee prone and with enthusiasm." Anyway, a window into his sense of humor, perhaps. But as I was saying, he was a sort of self-trained chef that started early on with my mom and her periodic diets. And he documented that by writing, "A chef I am not, but I'm willing to try it. Our agreement is that I'll cook while you diet. That agreement is clever, and I think, if you please, that you'll find that when I cook, all diet with ease." And he went on in a later volume to say, "The kitchen was mine. I was firm as a rock. I'd cook all the meals, most in my walk. Stir fry with chicken, vaguely Chinese. You want something different? I'll stir fry with peas." So it was not a particularly broad repertoire at that point. But as many of you know, and I'm sure the folks who taught with him at OUKC, he loved to cook, and he was also incredibly frugal. And what that meant was he would usually buy ingredients in bulk, cook in bulk, and then eat that one stew that he made for every meal for about 2 weeks straight. So if you were in that lunch bunch, you probably saw and wondered, why is he eating the same stew every single meal? But that was why. As I mentioned, these volumes always touched on 3 things: work, church, and family. With regard to work, my dad received his PhD in philosophical theology from Yale Divinity School, and wasn't sure what was going to happen after that. But he got a call from Ottawa University and decided to visit. And he documented this event by writing, "Land in the city and then rent a car. Drive to the college, it wasn't too far. I returned unimpressed. The land was quite flat. The school wasn't with it, and Baptist at that." But despite that, that's where he chose to put down his roots and spent his entire career at Ottawa University, first on the main campus. And I remember this administration building. He obviously initially started as a professor and was teaching courses, which was his true love. But eventually he got tenure, and then shortly thereafter got sucked into administrative roles. I remember his office being these two offices, the two windows here on the administration building. Here he shows himself sitting in a chair shortly after having received tenure. And he wrote, "And then came a message obscure and remote. Would I see the dean on a matter of note? Well, tenure and all, this wasn't foreseen. He wanted to make me associate dean." And I think this is because he was very smart. He was very personable. He would listen to people. He had an ability to sort of gently shift their views. And I think he was quite effective, and he was incredibly hardworking as dean. It did take his toll, though, because if you look through the volumes, as he talks about his work, once he becomes dean, you can see him sort of over a desk with a bunch of papers on it, with his green visor on as he's toiling away. Maybe a couple of years later, it looked like this, somewhat more harried, and you can see the text here says self-study report. So he was deeply engaged in writing a self-study. And then a few years later, it was depicted by this, a clearly somewhat broken man who the administration had sucked the life from. But he was excited eventually to transition back to the classroom. That classroom happened to be up at OUKC, where he found wonderful community with the other members of that faculty and staff. His stint as dean wasn't without any reward, though. One that he noted in his writing, he documented with this text. He wrote, "But there are honors, and one not the least, to be honored guest at the Old English feast. Attired in tights and you in your gown, a night of enjoyment in spite of my crown." So he got to don tights and an outfit and be the master of ceremonies at the Old English feast that was put on periodically at the college. A second of the topics that always came up was the church and their involvement in the church, and you can see his illustrations here in front of Grace Episcopal Church. My mom was the organist in the church and the choir director, and that's probably why my dad ended up in the choir. But it clearly stuck with him. He sang in the choir in whatever church he belonged, and I know that he sang in the choir here at Colonial Church and had some really special friendships as a result of that involvement. And then, of course, he would write about his family. And he might have talked about the work section using words like exhaustion, and he might have talked about the church section as frustrating because they were constantly having to find new priests at Grace Episcopal. The family section was probably best characterized as joyful and proud. Within these volumes are the story of Rachel's adoption. He wrote about that upon getting this phone call from Wichita. "You swirled around and got all prepared. I sat on the couch and I got all scared. I'd known it would happen one way or the other, but me as a father and you as a mother, we entered the room and looked at that baby. All doubts disappeared. Not a shadow of maybe." I can't read it. She slept, but we held her, and holding her smiled. She was ours, yours and mine, this beautiful child. When Nathaniel was born, he wrote, on Monday I left a final to Proctor, and finally it came with the aid of a doctor. On December 15th at 7 minutes to 10, Nathaniel was added to the strong race of men. I don't think gender's really a race, but sometimes the rhymes are quite forced in these memories. And then with regard to me, he wrote, and blessed it was on that Christmas morn, midst chaos in Bethlehem, old Noah was born. At home, celebration was held off for you, so that Christmas went on for a week, maybe two. My mother and I were both born on Christmas Day. Throughout these volumes, he recounted camping trips in our trusty, or sometimes not quite so trusty, red tent, trips to Colorado, but more frequently trips to Peter Cove, Michigan, his favorite place on earth, where he spent his childhood's summers growing up. There's a picture, an illustration of a fateful canoe trip that my brother and I took with my parents after dropping my sister off with some friends in Kentucky, I think, where we capsized and nearly got trapped under a tree, and it was a rather traumatic experience, but he remembered it in a lighthearted tone. He, of course, documented our growth and development through music. We all played instruments. My sister, the most talented of us, played the cello and may periodically still play the cello. Nathaniel on the violin and me on the trombone. They spent countless nights at the ball fields and courts, watching and cheering us on as we played various sports, softball with Rachel and Nathaniel here with golf clubs and the basketball, and me in catcher's gear, how I started my baseball career. Of course, our mother passed, and he stopped documenting these annual histories. And I think it must have been quite jarring, because around that time my dad transitioned from a house full with 3 kids to, in a few short years, being by himself. But he moved to Kansas City, and he found community at Colonial Church and at in other groups, working at the OUKC, in Overland Park, where he continued to have many wonderful friendships. And there were bumps along the way, and I won't get into what some of those bumps were, but eventually he met Linda, and and that was a tremendous development in his life that brought tremendous meaning to it again. And I can only imagine, had he continued these books, what he would have written about over the last 28 years or so. I'm sure he would have documented their adventures to Europe, often to South Dakota and to Peter Cove. They came and saw me and my family when we were based in Oxford, England for a couple of years. And he would have documented with humor and joy his grandchildren and his adventures with them. My kids, Theo and Emma, my brother's daughter Ava, and my sister's daughter Sophie and Lily. He was an amazing grandfather who loved nothing more than to grab a book and sit down with a grandchild and read it, or walk off into Lake Michigan and frolic and toss them up into the air. And he found great joy in his grandchildren. I was blessed to have my dad move to Western Massachusetts a couple years ago. And we got to know each other on a whole nother level, and I'm grateful that I had that opportunity. I'm also grateful for Berkshire Place, which is the facility where he lived, and formed wonderful relationships with so many of the staff there who cared for him wonderfully and embraced him in all his quirks and his sense of humor, and helped him find joy and dignity every single day. I want to thank you all again for coming today to share this day with us. And I'll leave you with one last verse that he wrote that I think is appropriate. He wrote, "The message is clear, it's simple and pat. The theme of this poem is quite simply that life here is precious and even enchanted, and never to be taken for granted. My family and friends, the things that I do, are valued and dear, especially you." And I think that sentiment extends to all of you here today, that the life here is precious and even enchanted and never to be taken for granted. My family and friends and the things that I do are valued and dear, especially you. So thank you again for coming, and I invite anybody who would like to share any thoughts or memories that they might have of Peter. You don't need to have visual aids or a laser pointer.